It was 1997, and I was living in a city called Reseda, 20 miles north of downtown LA. House parties were a thing back then, but they didn't always take place in houses. Sometimes they were in abandoned warehouses, under freeways, and even in abandoned train tunnels. So yeah, these were raves before they were called raves. And not everyone knew about these parties, where they were, or when they would happen. You had to be plugged in and in the knowing, and my crew was plugged in. You see, back then, there wasn't any social media. You found out about these parties through word of mouth. There were also groups of party crews all over LA, putting together, promoting, or just being active in the scene. So as you can probably imagine, this was an underground community, and at times could be seedy and dangerous, and oftentimes was. This year, we had already attended one of the best parties of the year. I didn't think anything could have topped the experience. The party was held in a penthouse on a high-rise apartment building in downtown LA. The building was unfinished, so it was pretty much just a huge open space on the 30th floor. There weren't even any windows yet. The music was so loud it vibrated the floor. I could feel the bass hit, penetrating my chest, going straight through my body, and continuing, carried away into the night sky, 300 feet above unsuspecting civilians going about their business in the piss-puddled, rat-infested, dirty streets below. The only thing that can top this now would be a mansion party in the hills. But these were rare, and also a lot more exclusive and protected, so we had never been to one. We would hear only stories the next day. The girls in the pools, R&B singers and other celebrities, weird red light rooms and drugs, everything and anything you wanted or were brave enough to try. My friend called me one day, out the blue. He was messing with his rich girl from Woodland Hills, and she had told him about a mansion party this Friday on Mulholland Drive. He told me the password was Fidelio, but not to tell anyone, or we would burn the spot. I was super excited to attend my first mansion party in the hills, and that week dragged on, the minutes and hours moving at half the normal pace. But then, one day, my alarm rang, and it was early Friday morning. I went to school as usual, but the day flew by. Then, there I was, with 4 of my other friends knocking on the front door. The music thumping, muffled through the door, vibrating the house windows from the outside. A big guy answered the door in a black suit. He asked for the password. "Fidelio," I said, and we were in. The door opened up to a dark room with lights flashing in all directions. In the far end of the room, the entire wall was made of glass, the city lights glinting in the background like stars. There was a pool in the backyard, and there was girls that looked like models or actresses, just hanging out. Inside the house, each room seemed to be for a specific purpose. There was one room where a group of men and women were all enjoying each other's company, but let's just say it wasn't in the most wholesome way. As the night went on, I separated from my friends, but I made new ones. I indulged in almost everything. I eventually found one of my friends again. He told me he just met someone and got hooked up. But this wasn't your ordinary. It wasn't like the 70s anymore where it was on tabs and you stuck it under your tongue. This came in the form of a blue liquid, and all you had to do was put 1 drop in your eye. We laughed hysterically, and without hesitation, put a drop in each eye. The liquid felt cool, almost like when you inhale a lot of eucalyptus and feel it in your eyes. It didn't take long for it to take effect. The music. The music was a living, breathing entity, pulsating through the air like colorful waves. As I stood there, I could feel it vibrating in my chest, each beat resonating deep within me. The notes seemed to spiral and swirl, creating patterns that danced in front of me. Every sound was amplified. The bass thumped like a heartbeat, deep and primal, while the higher frequencies sparkled like tiny stars. It felt like the music was wrapping around me, pulling me into this rhythm. I closed my eyes for a moment, and suddenly, the melodies took on shapes. Each note blossomed into flowers of sound, blooming and fading, swirling in kaleidoscope of colors. The laughter and voices blended seamlessly with the music, creating a symphony of joy and connection. I could see the vibrations in the air, shimmering like heat waves, and I felt as if I were part of something greater, a collective pulse that united us all. But soon, I started to hear it. The voices intertwined in the drums and snare, speaking in whispers, laughing at me and calling my name. They grew louder and louder until they were no longer hidden behind the music but loud and clear. I noticed the guy staring at me in the corner of the room, smiling from ear to ear. I tried to ignore him, but it was like his gaze was like a magnet, and I could only pull away for a second before I had to look at him again. More faces in the crowd came forward now, all with the same look, and before long, most of the room was staring at me. I turned to walk away, but the security guard now stood there, a smile on his face. "The password," he said. "Fidelio," I responded. "Wrong, sir. Come with me." He walked me towards the door, and I actually felt relief. I was glad I was caught. Now I can leave this dream-turned nightmare. I knew I was tripping, and I just needed to get away and gather myself. But right before we got to the door, the security guard opened a closet and threw me in. I rolled down the flight of stairs into the basement. It was dark and cold and quiet at first. But then I heard it. A soft chanting from the far corner of the room. "Fidelio," they whispered, over and over again. They walked towards me, one with a dagger that had a human femur as a handle. I ran up the stairs and began to bang on a door. I screamed, but nobody answered. The group was moving slow, but getting closer. I kicked the door and threw my body against it. It wouldn't budge. The closer they got, the more frantic I became, kicking, punching, and scratching at the door. And then, it all went dark. The next day, I woke up in the hospital, IV in my arm. My hands were wrapped and elevated. My mother sat next to me. I asked her what happened. She told me I had disappeared from the party and locked myself in a coat closet. I must have been pounding and scratching at that door for hours. My fingers were all broken. My hands had multiple fractures, and all my fingernails were broken off. She also told me the security guard found me. He told the police he had heard the door rattle for hours, but it was in sync with the beat of the music, and the music was so loud he just thought it was the bass making the walls rattle. It wasn't until the music stopped that they discovered me. Fingers bloody and twisted, fingernails shattered, and a grin on my face. "Fidelio. Fidelio. Fidelio," I repeated. It was 113 degrees when I arrived in my new apartment in Phoenix, Arizona. The cabin of the U-Haul truck was air conditioned, so I hadn't felt the heat until I opened the door. And then it hit me, like a hot blow dryer to the face. And all I can think of in that moment was, oh no, what have I done? Are humans even supposed to exist in heat like this? A month earlier, I was living in Los Angeles, fighting the traffic and grinding my butt off for a microchip company I work for. I'm a programmer and work in a team that writes embedded software in microchips. Though I was at the bottom of the totem pole at that time. My boss approached me one day and offered me a new position. He called it a promotion. The only problem was, the new position was 400 miles away in Arizona. But the offer was way too good for me to refuse. So I took it. So now there I was, profusely sweating, skin burning under the scorching Arizona sun, as I moved my stuff into my new apartment. I was exactly 1 year into my new position when it all happened. The first case of coronavirus in the US. The news was talking about quarantine and lockdown, but I never thought they would actually make everyone quarantine. Boy, was I wrong. A short time after that, I found myself confined to my small apartment, the outside world growing distant by the day. The days began to blur into each other. It was summer again, and the temperatures grew increasingly hotter by the day. Nighttime gave little relief from the oppressive, suffocating heat. With the air conditioning humming like a distant ghost, I fell into the routine of work in isolation. At first, it was just a faint sound, a soft crying that drifted through the thin walls. I tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, becoming a haunting presence that echoed in my mind. Days turned into weeks, and still, the crying continued. And after a while, I started to become concerned. What if this person needs help, or just someone to talk to? I walked over and knocked on the apartment door, but there was no response. I asked if she was okay, or needed help, but again, no response. I pressed my ear against the door to try and hear what was happening inside the apartment, and to my surprise, a voice answered. I'm here. I'm so lonely. But nothing else. I asked if she needed help and tried to engage in conversation, but all I got in response was sobbing. She obviously didn't want to talk to anyone, so I eventually went back to my apartment. The crying didn't stop though. It continued for days. One day, I decided to call out through the thin walls. To my surprise, she responded. Her name was Vivian, and through her own whispered conversations, she revealed fragments of her life. Vivian was originally from Idaho, but she had moved to LA looking to get into acting. Things had not gone as planned, and she ended up in Phoenix with her abusive alcoholic boyfriend. They broke up, and she had not seen him for a long time. She didn't know anyone in Phoenix, and she was lonely. I felt an inexplicable connection to her and a need to help, but it didn't matter what I said. The crying continued. A few days later, I noticed that the crying had completely stopped. I knocked on the wall and called her name, but there was no answer. Days went by, and I figured she had gone out of town or back home to Idaho. A few days after that, I was checking my mailbox in the lobby and spotted my apartment manager. It had been a long time since I spoke to another person, in person, so I decided to start a conversation. And we mostly made small talk. We talked about the city, the hiking trails, and how beautiful Arizona is in the fall, winter, and spring. We also talked about the craziness of lockdown and how he had not spoke to another person in months. I told him that other than my neighbor through the wall, me too. I also mentioned that I had not heard from her for a while and asked if he had seen her. The manager's expression shifted quickly. He told me the apartment has been empty for 3 years. He caught a group of 6 squatters in that apartment once, and he bet that's who I was talking with. A squatter. He said he would check the apartment, and I told him I would go with him. The manager fumbled through a set of what seemed like 50 keys, hung on a hoop ring, clipped to his jeans belt loop. He tried a few keys unsuccessfully before finding the right one. As we stepped into the apartment, the air felt thick and stale, heavy with unease, almost like when you sense someone staring at you from behind. The apartment was barren, untouched, and the windows were sealed tight. It looked like no one had been in there for years. The manager looked over at me with an unmistakable look. The look that said, "There, are you happy now? Thanks for wasting my time." Feeling like I had to prove something, but mostly that I'm not crazy, I began to tell the manager everything the girl had told me. I told him that she was 24 years old, did some acting in small roles, possibly lived with her boyfriend, and her name was Vivian. He had a look of fear in his face that grew even more intense with every detail I gave him about her. "If you're talking about who I think you're talking about, that girl's dead," he said in a shaky voice. He then told me about the tragedy in apartment 305. A woman was killed by her boyfriend, he said. She was dismembered and her body stuffed in the fridge. The rent was paid for a full year, so no one discovered the body until the eviction cleanup crew came in. My stomach dropped as the weight of the manager's words sunk in. I felt sick, and the room began to spin. I had been talking to a ghost. We exited the apartment pretty quickly after that, and I didn't look back. That night, I booked a hotel and stayed there for the rest of the week until I could find a new apartment. Once I did, I hired a moving crew to move me out, and never again returned to that apartment. So if you ever hear someone calling to you in the dark of night, just remember, some stories don't end, they linger, waiting for someone to listen. And sometimes, what you hear may come from a place best left undisturbed.
I'm here. I'm so lonely.
When I was a boy, my mother told me a story that my grandfather told her about a time when he was a boy and strangers came into his town. This is that story. At the end of World War II, the world was a mosaic of shattered dreams and broken towns. Among the weary souls fleeing the rubble were a group of Eastern Europeans. They sailed across the ocean seeking refuge in a beautiful Central American country known for its lush jungles and vibrant culture. Upon their arrival, the locals greeted the newcomers with open arms, eager for fresh faces and new ideas. The Eastern Europeans, grateful for the warmth, set to work immediately. They built wells to provide clean water, established orphanages, and opened free medical facilities for those in need. Their commitment to peace and community soon made them beloved figures in the town. As the days turned to weeks, whispers of dissent began to fill the air. The country, once tranquil, was on the brink of revolution. Tension simmered between the government and those who sought change. Skirmishes erupted in the streets. In the midst of this chaos, the strangers emerged as intermediaries, advocating for dialogue and understanding between the two conflicting sides. Their charm and eloquence drew people in, and many began to view them as saviors. As the revolution gained momentum, People began to go missing, swallowed by the shadows of the night. The locals whispered of hit squads and the stranger's influence over the government. There were rumors of the stranger's late-night gatherings, where laughter and music echoed through the air. The people began to notice that the newcomers opened new businesses which took advantage of the land's beautiful resources. They opened lavish restaurants serving exotic dishes. The rich flocked to these establishments, mesmerized by the flavors they had never experienced before. As the revolution escalated, the streets became a battleground, and the tensions reached a boiling point. The government, desperate to maintain control, cracked down on dissent, and the streets ran red with the blood of the innocent. In the midst of this chaos, a platoon of soldiers entered the stranger's restaurant seeking shelter from heavy fire. What they discovered was a macabre and gory scene. In the kitchen, bodies hung in meat hooks, limbs on cutting boards, and organs simmered in pots. The platoon of soldiers, now aware of the dark secrets behind the lavish meals, launched a manhunt for the strangers. But it was too late. They had already slipped into the dark of the night. As the dawn broke over the Central American country, the aroma of their exotic dishes lingered in the air. The revolution would continue, but the true story of the strangers would remain a whispered legend, a chilling tale of horror disguised in gifts and friendship, in a paradise where the friendly people had momentarily welcomed them. So remember, not everything is what it seems, and not everything that glitters is gold. In the heart of the town of Eldridge, there exists a forest known as the Whispering Woods. Locals avoid it, especially after sundown. It is said that those that enter never return the same, or at all. This story starts with a group of friends around a campfire: Alex, Mia, and Jake. One night, they were hanging out, swapping ghost stories under the stars. Alex, always the brave one, brought up the tales of the woods. He said people claimed to hear whispers calling to them, luring them deeper into the darkness. Mia laughed it off. Those are just silly stories, she said. But Jake, he looked uneasy. What if it's true? He asked. The tension grew, and then Mia, feeling bold, dared them to go into the woods that very night. Let's prove it's all nonsense, Alex said, and before long, they grabbed their flashlights and headed towards the trees, their laughter echoing in the night air. But as they stepped into the forest, the mood shifted. The trees towered above them, casting long shadows, and an uneasy silence fell. Soon, they began to hear it. The whispers, soft at first, almost like the wind rustling through leaves, but unmistakable. "Do you hear that?" asked Mia, her bravado now fading. "It's just the wind," Jake replied. But even he didn't sound so sure. They pressed on, the whispers growing louder, almost forming words. They stopped, a chill running down their spines. "What do you think it means?" Mia whispered, glancing around nervously. "Maybe we should turn back," Jake suggested, his voice trembling. But just then, a loud snap echoed behind them. They turned, fear creeping in. Shadows danced between the trees, and the whispers intensified, sounding more frantic now. Mia's eyes widened. Guys, I really think we should go. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through them. What is that? In a rush of adrenaline, Mia turned and ran, the others following. The forest seemed to shift around them, twisting, turning, disorienting. The whispers were relentless, echoing in their ears as they stumbled deeper into the woods. Over here, Alex shouted, leading them towards the clearing. But as they emerged, they found themselves in front of an old crumbling stone altar. The air felt charged, heavy with an ancient presence. What is this place? Mia said, fear etched in her voice. It must be where they once sacrificed people, Jake murmured, glancing over his shoulder. The whispers were growing louder now, filling the air. Shadowy figures emerged from the trees surrounding them, their faces pale and sorrowful. You cannot leave. You belong to us now. Then, everything went silent. Days passed, and back in town, people started to notice something strange. Mia, Jake, and Alex had vanished without a trace. Two old men sat on a bench, their voices low and worried. Have you seen them? They went into the Whispering Woods, one said. You know what happened to the last group that went in there. The forest loomed, dark and foreboding, the whispers now a distant echo. So if you ever hear whispers in the woods, remember this tale. Some doors shouldn't be opened, and some places should be left alone.